Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. As some of you may know, I am a huge reader, as evidenced by the bookshelf behind me and the series of videos I did this year, which was a tour of said bookshelf. I primarily read fiction, and one of my favorite subgenres of that is historical fiction, which is a genre that I actually got into quite young, and I think had a real impact on me in terms of piquing my interest in the past and the stories of the past and people of the past, which eventually obviously led me to pursue a career as an archaeologist. So I thought today I would talk about my kind of favorite historic fiction books that I've read. The list that I'm going to go through today is obviously not comprehensive because that video would be like an hour. I don't think anybody wants the video to be that long. This is also just my own personal opinion. There's also obviously going to be books that I've missed or maybe I've not read. The books I'm going to mention here today cover a wide range of time periods, genres, and historical figures. It's not just limited to like one specific period. I do find I prefer to read quite widely in terms of the different places on the globe, different periods of time, and about people that I perhaps haven't read about before. I like that newness of that. I will say that if not all, like 95% of the historical fiction I read is about women in history because that's just what I identify with and that's what I'm interested in. I would like to think that this list is not only books that I like because I found them interesting to read, but also in that the immersiveness of them is really good because the author that wrote them took the time to actually research the time period and culture that they were writing about and transports you to that world through their writing. I also do appreciate when an author doesn't try to change a historical person or events to fit into like a stereotypical or archetypal storyline, and they instead let the story tell itself. They trust the history to be engaging enough to keep your interest rather than having to make stuff up to do that. There will be some repeats and overlap from my previous bookshelf tours, but there are new entries on this as well, and I'm also probably going to have a list at the end of honorable mentions of books that I would recommend. Additionally, this list is entirely my own opinion, so you are free to disagree with what I think is good and have your own opinion about it, but hopefully maybe I will help to inspire you or recommend some books for you to read. If you would like to support my channel and me continuing to make videos, please consider either giving me a like, subscribe, or comment. Okay, let's dig in. The first book series on this list is the Eleanor of Acquitaine trilogy by Elizabeth Chadwick, who is a very well-known English historic fiction writer. This is the Autumn Throne. This is the last book in the series. These books cover the entire lifetime of Eleanor of Acquitaine, who was a very powerful female duchess in medieval France, who then became the Queen of France, went on the Crusades, came back to France, divorced her husband, married the heir to the English crown, became the English queen, had a bunch of children, including Richard the Lionheart and King John from all the Robin Hood stories, and subsequently fell out with her husband, was imprisoned for a prolonged period of time by her husband because he wasn't happy with her, and then gets set free when her son Richard becomes King of England, and still continues to have an interesting life to the point where she actually escorted her granddaughter from Castilla in Spain to her marriage in France when Eleanor herself was like 80. Like, she's had an incredible life, which I think a lot of the time when I read about her in fiction gets covered in bits and pieces. So like people will only talk about her becoming Queen of France and then Queen of England, and then they just kind of stop after that and they're like, oh, and they lived happily ever after, which is definitely not the case. So the thing I really like about this series is that it covers her entire lifetime. Elizabeth Chadwick, like I said, she's one of those authors that tries to let the history tell itself rather than having to make up a lot of stuff to make it interesting. Obviously, with historic fiction, you do have to do a certain amount of fictionalized storytelling because we don't know exact conversations people had, we don't have entirely accurate historical records, and sometimes you do have to kind of plug the gaps. But I think that she does a really good job of doing that, and she also has done an extensive amount of research on the time period she writes in. She kind of specializes in this specific period of Western European medieval history, and she does it incredibly well when she writes it. She is most well known for her books on William Marshall, who was actually a knight of Eleanor of Acquitaine and then went on to become like the greatest knight in history. And she has done a lot of other books as well, but this particular trilogy I just really enjoy reading. One of the things I really love about these books is how much attention to detail the author pays to not only how medieval life was in terms of like how your day was divided, what kind of clothes you were wearing in terms of fabric and style, but also things like language. Best example of this is the title of the character in the book. Her anglicized name, as many of us know her, is Eleanor of Acquitaine, but in her lifetime she actually would have been called Eleanor or Eleanor. Not quite 100% sure on the pronunciation, but it's a different spelling, it's a different way that it was being said, and that is how she is named in the book. There's also references to the fact that there is a difference between the Languedoc that she speaks and was brought up speaking, which is native to her duchy of Poitiers and Acquitaine, and the kind of French that was spoken at the French court in Paris. Also the fact that, you know, the kings of England for a very long time all spoke French and not English because they were all from France. So if you're looking for a really great, well-researched historical fiction book about powerful medieval queen, 100% would recommend this trilogy to you, as well as her other books. Next up is another repeat from my collection, which is The Wild Girl by Kate Forsyth. So this is just a single book, it's not part of a trilogy, and it is basically the story of the brothers Grimm told through the lens of their neighbor Henriette Dorothy Wilde, who was not only their neighbor but was also one of their major sources for their stories and their storytelling collection that they are famous for. The book covers quite a long period of time and is primarily set in the city of Kessel in part of Germany, but it's like a princedom, so it's not Germany as we know it now. And the time period itself is set before, during, and after the Napoleonic Wars of Europe, which serve as quite a backdrop to a lot of the things that end up happening in the book. In my opinion, the author really beautifully captures 19th century German in her setting of this book, especially in the fact that it tells the story of people who would have been considered middle to definitely lower class, poor people living in poverty, and the kind of ups and downs and effects that the Napoleonic Wars had on the lives of normal people who were not soldiers or high up nobles. The majority of the characters in this book are all real people, and the story itself does broadly follow historical events, and additionally there's also, I think, quite a lot of interpretation about what the main character, her life would have been like. We don't have any of her diaries to read about what her life would have been like, so we have to, so all the sources about her are secondary, such as the journal of Wilhelm Grimm, so there still are kind of primary sources that we can draw on. The story also isn't just like all roses. It does cover some very adult topics such as opiate drug abuse, sexual abuse, and the horrid aftermath of war and PTSD, etc. So I definitely wouldn't say that it's suitable for a younger audience, and also it could be very triggering to people who have experienced the kind of situations that I just mentioned. I will say though that it is worth reading. The end of this book makes me at least tear up, if not cry, every time I read it. And it is just a really beautiful, beautiful story. Next, we have the Royal Diary series. So these are only 2 books within the series. There are many, many more. I don't know the exact count. As you can see from their size, these are like pre-teen / teen books, and they are kind of self-explanatory in terms of their title. They are written as the diaries of famous female historical figures that provide like a snapshot, usually into a very important time period in their life in their teenage years. You know, a lot of historical women were probably married by the time that they were 16, 17. And because they are famous historical figures and lots of massive events are going on in their life, these books tend to cover a lot of those things. For example, this one, which is about famous Queen Elizabeth I of England, covers the end of her father's reign, and it covers a lot the topic of this uncertainty within her life about whether or not she was in favor with her father, whether he considered her a legitimate child who could inherit the throne or not, and how being in and out of his favor like affected her life. So they are written like they are diaries, but obviously the majority of the people covered in these books wouldn't have actually written diaries, with the exception of 1 or 2. So there is that element of them having to falsify some stuff. Also, a lot of the teen years of many female historical figures don't get written about in a lot of detail, so there is a certain element of having to kind of make up characters and some storylines to make these people relatable to modern day teenage girls. That being said, at the end of every book, there is an epilogue to tell you what happened to them in the rest of their life, a historical note that talks about the time that this book is set. And as a part of the historical note, there are things like family trees and portraits and things that can give you a lot more information about what their actual life was like, what they might have looked like, etc. A highlight of this series for me is the fact that they don't just focus on Western women for their characters. They go all over the globe with books set in Africa, China, Japan, Korea, the Americas, etc., and they cross all kinds of time periods. My personal favorite ones out of the entire series that I've read are Jahanara of India, Isabella of Castilla, the Lady of the Chiao of China, who we don't actually know her actual personal name, and Cleopatra the Seventh of Egypt, the famous Cleopatra, which is actually the first one of these books that I ever got. So if you've got a child or a girl that you're trying to get interested maybe in history, or you want to broaden your child's horizons about the kind of history that they're learning about, so it's not just the stuff in the textbooks, I would definitely recommend this series if you can find them. They're not being printed anymore, but I think you can probably find them on the internet. I don't know why they stopped printing them because they're just like amazing. Okay, last repeat book from my bookshelf is this chunker, Here Be Dragons by Sharon K. Penman. This book was given to me by the finds manager at my archaeology company that I work at. And when she gave it to me, she basically said, this is like the best, most accurately, authentically researched, written historical fiction I've ever read, which I think is quite a stellar recommendation. And I would 100% agree with her. This book is incredibly immersive, which is a theme in a lot of Sharon K. Penman's work. She really does let the story tell itself rather than making things up to move the plot line along. The book itself is the story of Joan, who is an illegitimate daughter of King John of England, who was married to Llewellyn the Great, who was like the first ever prince unifier of Wales. And the book deals a lot with the tensions and how you deal with the fact that you have a husband who you love and support, and you have a father who you also love, but they are very much at loggerheads most of the time. How do you navigate that relationship? I like that this book tries to be really true to what King John might have been like, but also it tells a story through the lens of his illegitimate daughter, who absolutely idolized him. Parts of this book that I really enjoyed are how it shows the difference between Welsh and English culture and cultural practices. And also just kind of the difference between like way mindsets were at the time. You know, a medieval man would marry a woman, and especially if you were a lord, it really wouldn't be a problem if you decided to sleep with somebody outside of your marriage. Nobody would really think twice about it, whereas obviously if it was a woman, that's entirely unacceptable. Another key thing that I didn't know about Welsh cultural practices at that time was that illegitimate children had outside of a Christian marriage were considered completely equal to legitimate children born inside of a marriage. So say if you had a child from a relationship before you got married, inheritance-wise, that child would have an equal and sometimes superior portion to your married children because they're still your firstborn. So there's a lot of that in the book, which I really enjoyed reading about and learning about. And overall, I thought the story was really interesting, especially because she wove something that felt really authentic out of a situation and a story that is very much sidelined whenever people come to talk about King John and Llewellyn the Great. Okay, so moving into the books we haven't already covered. This next book is probably, like, I would say the book that got me into historical fiction, and definitely one that contributed towards my very much mentioned love of ancient Egypt and desire to study archaeology / Egyptology at university. And that is Child of the Morning by Pauline Gedge. I'm fairly confident that this is the first ever adult historic fiction novel that I ever read, and I did read it as a teenager. It is an imagined retelling of the life of King Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty of New Kingdom Egypt, who was the only woman in the history of ancient Egypt to reign as a pharaoh, not just like a queen or a regent, in her own right over a period of 21 years, which were incredibly prosperous for the kingdom. This author has also written a couple other books set in ancient Egypt, as well as a story about like the revolts and Roman invasion of England around the time of Boudica, which I have read, but this one is 100%, in my opinion, my best and favorite. Hatshepsut is like probably my favorite historical figure of all time. It was originally published in 1977, so it is quite old, and in that way, in terms of speaking about the authenticity and historical accuracy of the book, it's not the most accurate, but this will be because obviously we've learned a lot more about Hatshepsut since 1997 that, you know, the author couldn't have known about when she was writing the book. Also, in case you didn't know, Hatshepsut is a historical figure who lived a couple thousand years ago, and after she died, there were efforts by successive pharaohs to effectively eliminate her from the historical record, either defacing her monuments and replacing her name with their own, taking her out of historical texts, etc. So, in comparison to someone like Eleanor of Acquitaine, there are a lot less historical documents about Hatshepsut, and there's a lot more to kind of unpick about her life for historians because so many other people tried to take credit for things that she did. Nonetheless, the world building in this novel is very rich and lush, I would say. It really makes me want to just like go time travel to ancient Egypt and just like lie in a barge on the Nile. And I would say that this book is a great read. She somehow manages to make the fact that the pharaohs practiced sibling incest with their sisters and had sexual relationships with them. She somehow manages to make that not incredibly gross and uncomfortable for someone to read, which is quite an accomplishment. As I said, I read this book as a teenager, but there is definitely adult content in it, so please consider that if you're either going to recommend it or try it yourself. Next is Blood of Flowers by Anita Amirrezvani. It is set in the 17th century in Iran, in the city of Isfahan, during the reign of the Safavid Shah Abbas the Great. The story itself is about a girl whose father dies, leaving her without a dowry, and her journey to become a designer and maker of Persian carpets. The characters in the story are mostly almost entirely fictional, but the setting, themes, and like world building of the novel are very authentic and are just like chef's kiss amazing. Like, oh, it felt so lush when I was reading it. The novel covers topics that I know I'm personally unfamiliar with, like a sigeh or sighe, which is a type of temporary marriage that allowed a man and a woman to get married and have sex, but it was a temporary relationship that you could renew. The woman didn't have a lot of control over the contract, like the man was the one who renewed it. It also covers the themes of like family and, you know, what do you do with family who are like poor and destitute when you take them in. And obviously a major theme of the novel is the art of rug or carpet making of ancient Persia, which I had no idea about before I read this book, but it sounds like super, super interesting. This novel actually has put the city of Isfahan in modern day Iran on my like list of places I really hope that I can visit one day, just because of like how it was described in the book, as well as the fact that like I 100% just like want to own a Persian handmade rug at some point in my life. I would love if I could do that. And the author makes an effort to kind of like highlight a lot of important things in this novel, such as the architecture of Isfahan itself. For example, very heavily featured is the Naqsh-e-Jahan, not sure if I'm saying that right, square, which is a massive square market in the city that was built by Abbas the Great. It is almost a character in itself in the book. It's actually a UNESCO Modern World Heritage Site in modern day. Another particular thing I enjoyed reading about just in like one paragraph of the book was a description of house building and how they utilized engineering and architecture to essentially create an air conditioning system that would draw cool air into the house without using any of our modern machinery or techniques, which I'm sure is probably still an architectural and home building technique that is used in the Middle East to this day. The novel also incorporates a lot of Persian poetry and fables. Two of them are made up by the author, but the rest are authentic, and she weaves them into the story. I really enjoyed getting those little snippets of like Persian culture throughout the book. This is another book that I would recommend for late teenagers slash adults because there are definitely some adult scenes. It's definitely a book I would recommend, especially if you're looking to read like historic fiction about Persia, which is not something that I have seen any, if a lot of, in Western literature. Okay, so these are kind of the last two books I'm going to talk about in depth, and they're not really related except that they're written by the same author. And those books are The Romanov Empress and The Last Queen by C.W. Gortner. The first book is about Maria Fyodorovna, who was the mother of the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, and who is perhaps most famous for the fact that she very famously did not get along with her daughter-in-law, the Tsarina Alexandra, and she managed to survive the Russian Revolution and is usually featured very heavily in any kind of Survivor Anastasia / Anna Anderson stories. She's the famous Romanov grandmother. She herself, outside of the Russian Revolution, had a very, very interesting life, which I don't think a lot of people know about. And this book does, I think, a really good job of developing her character so that you really see where she comes from in terms of her conflict with her daughter-in-law. The book also does a really good job of setting up the circumstances that led to the Russian Revolution. And I think you really do come away with it having a greater understanding that it wasn't just the fact that Tsar Nicholas wasn't exactly the best emperor, and he is entirely the reason why the Romanov family fell from power. It really kind of shows very well that the Russian Revolution very likely would have happened sooner or later. It features a cast of characters that are often overlooked in a lot of the stories that get told about the end of the Romanovs. When people tell this story, they focus on Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children and Rasputin, and that's kind of it. And it's a really beautifully written book about Russia in general. The Last Queen is completely unrelated, except for the fact that it's historical fiction, and it tells the story of Joanna the Mad, who is actually the first queen of entirely unified Spain and was the daughter of the famous Isabella of Castilla and Ferdinand of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs. The book is told from her perspective and covers the main events of her life, and I think does a really good job of looking into this whole claim that she was crazy / insane, which in those days meant that she had to be confined to a nunnery and be a figurehead as a monarch rather than actually ruling. The way the book is portrayed, it kind of shows that she was actually put into a really difficult and awful situation and was very much manipulated at the whim of her husband and her father, who used her to achieve their own ends. Much of this is done against her own will, and as a woman who is highly educated and the daughter of a very famous independent queen, the book kind of puts across the idea that her resistance to this manipulation is what led to the rise of this idea that she was mad and needed to be locked up. And while there's no way that we could actually know the actual events and what she actually was like as a person and whether or not this is very close to what actually happened, I think that it's really plausible, which is what I liked about it. I could really see this being the actual case of what happened. Similar to the Romanov Empress, this book does a really good job of highlighting somebody who often gets shoved to the side. When we're talking about history or people writing historic fiction, people don't really focus on her. They'd rather focus on her mother, her father, her husband, her son, or her sister, Catherine of Aragon, who married Henry VIII. Okay, those are the main books that stand out to me when I think, what are my favorite historic fiction novels? What are things that I would read again? What are things that when I read them, I was like, I felt like I was there in that point in time. But obviously it's not comprehensive. There's a lot more historic fiction that I like. So now we're just gonna have a short list of honorable mentions. The first one is The Red Tent by Anna Diamant, which is the story of Dinah or Dina, who is the daughter of Jacob and Leah from the Bible, famous sister of Joseph of the many-colored dream coat. This is a really, I think, great historical retelling of a biblical story without trying to involve too much of the God element to it. It's not that God's not in the story. I think it just does a really good job of trying to put it in a kind of historical setting of what life would have been like as a nomadic person in Israel / Palestine at that point in history. Another book in that kind of area of the world, which is The Dovekeepers by Alice Hoffman. Tragic book because it's about the siege of Masada, which is a very famous event in Jewish history, but also very interesting in that the occupation of the main people who are the characters in the story, is that of being Dovekeepers. We've entirely forgotten about dovekeeping as a modern society, which I think is kind of interesting and sad. Someone was talking about it with me the other day about how, you know, we essentially bred these birds to be stupid and provide us with like meat, and they were a huge part of our lives and lifestyle for a long period of time, and then at some point we just kind of like dropped them as a food source. Really interesting to learn about dovekeeping. You know, you see ducats, dovecot everywhere in like medieval castles, and so I think it's really interesting to read this book and learn about dovekeeping and what that would have been like. This is the Zetian Duology by Weina de Randel, which is also called the Empress of the Bright Moon, separated into 2 books, and it tells the life of Zetian. I really enjoyed this book, and I picked it up because it's about a very famous character in Chinese history, the only female emperor regnant in her own right, similar to Hatshepsut. And I really enjoyed it the first time I read it. Reread, not so much. And I think this is partly because I've read quite a bit about Zetian as a historical figure. And while I enjoyed learning so much about imperial and medieval China in this book, and also Chinese culture, which I don't know much about, I do think that this author went a little bit overboard in her characterization of Wu as being almost a victim. So historical accounts of her are incredibly exaggerated and biased against her, which I don't argue with at all, but I think that this author went too far in trying to make her a sympathetic victim heroine figure. And I would have enjoyed something, I think, that was a bit more balanced, because personally I think that she probably was a lot more calculating a person than she gets shown as in this book. But you should read it for yourself and find out. Another novel set in China is Threads of Silk by Amanda Roberts. This is another story that is told by a fictional character, but is set in obviously like a very pivotal time in history. So the main character is an embroidery girl in the court of Empress Cixi of Imperial China, which is right at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, and the novel just basically tells the story of the crumbling of Imperial China and does a very interesting and good job of it, in my opinion. That's it for my probably very long list. You might be surprised to find that Philippa Gregory and Hilary Mantel don't feature on this list at all. For Hilary Mantel, this is entirely because her books in particular just don't interest me as a reader. They have a male protagonist and they're set in the Tudor period, which I'm just like sick of reading about. But I will say that I have heard that her novels are like extensively well researched, and she does a really good job of trying to tell a story within the confines of what actually happened. Philippa Gregory, I have a bit more of a complicated relationship with her writing. I have read her Cousins War series and I did enjoy it when I read it, but I think one of the reasons that it's not on this list is partially because like it's not amongst my favorite books. Like, they were good, but I'm not like sitting here being like, oh, I can't wait for the next Philippa Gregory book. But also, like, I'm so sick of reading about the Plantagenets and the Tudors, as I just mentioned. I feel like they've been done to death and I'm tired of reading about them. And obviously Philippa Gregory, those are her 2 time periods that she knows. Those are the characters that she writes about. They just don't hold that much appeal for me anymore. I also just have to mention that like probably one of my least favorite historic fiction books of all time is The Other Boleyn Girl. I cannot stand that book, mostly because it is so historically inaccurate. Like, I can't take it. And I in particular really dislike the portrayal of Mary Boleyn as this kind of innocent ingenue who is the victim of Anne Boleyn's scheming, who fell in love with King Henry and then her sister took him away from her, when actually in real life Mary Boleyn was the mistress of the French king long before she met Henry VIII. She was not like an innocent virgin. She probably entered a relationship with him knowing that it would be temporary and maybe perhaps she would be maîtresse en titre or have children by him, but there's no way that I think she would have expected him to like love her forever and ever and for her to never be replaced. Additionally, I don't think that there's really any evidence that her relationship with him overlapped with her sister's relationship with him, where basically her sister effectively stole him from her. And it's a very sympathetic portrayal of Henry VIII. He was incredibly fickle. He liked the chase. He went from woman to woman very much. And that's just one of the many historically inaccurate things about that book, and I just can't stand it. Another pet peeve about Philippa Gregory's writing is the fact that she uses the phrase "do you" everywhere in all of her dialogue in her books. Anyway, that's my list of my personal favorites and recommendations when it comes to the genre of historical fiction. Obviously, I am not an expert in all of the various time periods and cultures that are covered by the books that I've listed here. So I'm not going to be like the final say in terms of like, this is 100% historically accurate, but you know, nothing can be. Women suffer from being marginalized and ignored in historical records. So with these kinds of stories, it is hard to find something that is going to be really, really accurate, because a lot of these women don't get written about, and what does get written about them is not about their personal lives and thoughts and feelings. It's about historic dates, events, how much money they paid people, and how many furs they ordered, etc. So there's always going to be a variety of interpretation. That's it for today. What did you guys think? Do you have any books to recommend for me? I'm always on the lookout for more. Have you read any of the books that I've mentioned here? Do you agree with my assessment? Do you disagree with it? If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. I'm also happy to attempt to answer any questions, comments, or concerns in the comment section below. So if you have any, please put them there and I will try to get back to you. If you would like to support my channel and see more from me, please check out my other videos and subscribe to my channel and hit the bell notification button. As usual, my socials are below in the description if you would like to follow me on Twitter or Instagram. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Bye!